A wealthy single father saw a Turka, woman being beaten, her baby taken away. Then he buys her ex-husband's house and gets her baby back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park where children's laughter mingled with the soft rustle of leaves. Paul Blake sat on a bench near the playground sipping his coffee, whilst keeping an eye on his 6-year-old son, Finn. Finn was gleefully chasing a football across the grass. Just as Hall turned to check his mobile, a scream cut through the Connois, peaceful air. "No, please don't. Take her," a woman's voice cried. "Out." Paul's head snapped up. Not far from the fountain, a woman, with messy hair and tear-streaked cheeks, was being pulled to the ground by a man in a dark suit. Clutched in the man's other arm was a little girl no older than 4, crying and reaching back toward her mother. "Howard, stop! You can't do this!" the woman sobbed, trying to stand. The man shoved her back roughly. People watched from a distance, but did nothing, their inaction a silent condemnation. Paul stood up quickly, a sense of duty overriding any hesitation. "Hey!" he shouted, striding towards them with purpose. "That's enough." The man turned, anger flashing in his eyes. "Stay out of this. It's a family matter." Paul pulled out his mobile. "This looks rather more like assault to me. Perhaps I should ring the police." The man hesitated, then hissed something vile at the woman before, storming off with the child, who was still crying out, "Mummy! Mummy!" Paul knelt beside the woman, who was trembling on the oa grass. "Are you all right?" She looked at him with wide, panicked eyes. "They took her," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "They took my daughter." Paul helped her up gently. "Come on, let's get you seen to at the hospital." After the bruises on her wrist were tended to in A&E and the adrenaline had settled, she sat quietly beside him in the waiting room. Her name was Isla. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said quietly. "You don't have to apologize," Paul replied, his voice firm. "That man, Howard, he was hurting you and your daughter." She nodded slowly then, as if releasing a floodgate, her voice broke. "He's my ex-husband, a counselor, influential. After the divorce, he used everything he had, money, power, connections, to paint me as unstable. He had a fake psychiatric evaluation filed against me. I was forced into a facility for 6 weeks. By the time I got out, custody was gone." Paul stared at her, stunned. "That's criminal." He made it look clean, legal. He made it seem so utterly believable. "I don't even have visitation rights." He claimed I'm a danger to Ava, but I'm not. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm her mother. She needs me." Paul's jaw clenched. "I believe you." Isla looked at him, uncertain. "You don't even know me." "I know what it feels like to fight for your child," Paul said, softly. "Finn's mother died in an accident. The courts didn't think a single father could handle it. They questioned everything. I had to prove myself every single step of the way." Isla's face softened. "So you truly do understand, more than you think," Paul replied. They sat in silence for a moment, before he added, "Let me help you." Isla looked up, startled. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one else is and because no child should be ripped away from someone who truly loves them. Isla wiped her eyes. I just want to see her again. Hold her. Tell her I didn't leave her. Paul nodded. We'll make sure she knows. And in that quiet hospital corridor, something shifted. It wasn't just sympathy, but the beginning of justice, of healing, of something neither of them had expected when they woke up that morning under the dim evening light filtering through the guest house window. Hila sat hurled on the edge of the sofa. She was clutching a warm cup of tea that Paul had made. She had barely spoken since they arrived, her arms still trembling from the events in the park. Paul stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her silently, before stepping in with gentle purpose. You're safe here, he said quietly, setting down a blanket beside her. My son Finn is asleep in the main house, just through the garden. No one knows you're here. Isla gave a faint nod, her lips pressed tightly together. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered after a pause. You didn't even know me. You didn't need to be known, Paul replied, his tone firm yet kind. You needed help. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound was the wind brushing softly against the trees outside. Later that night, as the rain began to patter against the roof, Isla finally began to speak. Her voice was quiet but steady. It started when I got pregnant, she said. Howard was different then. Charming, powerful. I thought I was safe. She gave a bitter laugh. He didn't want a daughter, he wanted a son. Said girls were weak. When Ava was born, he barely held her. Paul listened, his expression unreadable, though a cold fury was settling in his chest. He started isolating me, Hila continued. He told friends I was unstable, stopped me from working. Then the pushing began. Then the bruises. When I tried to leave, he said no judge would believe me. And he was right. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photo of a toddler girl with big brown eyes. Ava's all I had, and he took her, she said, her voice breaking. Said I was insane. Paul leaned forward slightly. How did he convince the court? He faked it, she said. Paid off a doctor. They diagnosed me with delusional disorder. One hearing, 20 minutes. And she was gone. Paul clenched his jaw. Do you know the doctor's name? Dr. Greaves, she said, her voice sharp with memory. He worked with Howard on some kind of health board project years ago. Paul made a mental note. The next morning, while Isla rested, Paul made a few quiet calls. As a successful investor and single father, he had long-standing relationships in both financial and legal circles. Within hours, he had confirmation. Dr. Peter Greaves had once been on the board of a hospital expansion project funded by Howard's campaign donations. Not only that, there had been whispers of misconduct. Nothing proven, nothing formal. Paul leaned back in his chair, thinking. That afternoon, he returned to the guest house with a file in hand. Hila sat on the porch, sunlight, catching her hair. I think you were right, he said, offering her the folder. This is just the beginning, but it's something. She opened the file and her eyes widened. That's him, she murmured. Dr. Greaves? Paul pointed to a section highlighted in red. These were payments made by a shell company tied to Howard's old property firm. One went to Greaves the week before your hearing. Isla's hands shook. Paul looked at her, his voice low. He bought your diagnosis, and I am going to help you prove it. She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the shock of someone at long last believing her. You really mean that? She whispered. I do, Paul said simply, and I won't stop until we get your daughter back. Paul had never dealt with family court before, but he knew the stench of corruption when he encountered it. After securing the evidence of Dr. Greaves' connection to Howard, he wasted no time hiring a legal team. They had a reputation for dismantling dirty legal maneuvers. He explained the case to them in crisp, matter-of-fact sentences, hiding the fury bubbling underneath. This isn't just about a custody battle, he told them. It's about a woman stripped of her rights and a child kept from her mother through lies and power. The head of the firm, a composed woman named Elise Monroe, raised an eyebrow. If half of what you're saying is true, Mr. Blake, we're going to expose a very ugly mess. That's the plan, Paul said, simply. Within days, the legal team began digging into the court records. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The solicitor, originally assigned to Isla's defense, had suddenly withdrawn right before the custody hearing. He was replaced by a young associate whose records showed had only passed the bar 3 months earlier. His defense was half-hearted, almost as if designed to fail. The transcripts revealed that Isla's objections during the hearing were dismissed without due consideration. The judge, an old university friend of Howard's, had rubber-stamped the psychiatric report without requesting a second opinion. It was never a fair fight, Elisa concluded. She was never meant to win. When Isla heard the findings, she sat in stunned silence, her hand clasped over her mouth. All this time, she whispered, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. Maybe I'd acted too emotional, but it was all set up. Paul sat beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You didn't lose your daughter because you failed. You lost her because they cheated, and now we fight back. The legal team also began reaching out to former staff members of Howard's household. Most refused to speak, but after a week of persistent digging, Paul's team found one name that stood out. Rosa Jimenez, a former live-in housekeeper who had left just a few months before the custody hearing. She agreed to meet on one condition. I want protection, she told Elise over a secure phone line. He has friends in high places. I have 2 boys. I won't put them at risk. Done, Elise assured her. We'll file a confidentiality clause. You'll testify remotely, and your identity will be sealed. At the meeting, Rosa's voice trembled, but her memories were sharp. He hit her, Rosa said, more than once. I saw him push her down the stairs, then told the staff she was clumsy. She cried every night. He threatened her, said she'd never see her baby again. Isla's hands clenched tightly. Thank you for speaking, she said. You don't know what this means. Rosa's voice softened. I remember you reading to your baby every morning. I remember the love. That's what stayed with me. Testimony was recorded, encrypted, and submitted as part of the appeal package. Elisa's team filed with the court. Alongside it were financial, documents, transcripts, and the psychiatric fraud evidence tied to Greaves. Paul watched it all unfold, managing logistics, financing, and communications. But quietly, he was preparing something else. He had been tracking Howard's property dealings. One property caught his attention, a small home on the outskirts of town, up for discreet sale. The address was familiar. It had once belonged to Howard and Hila before the divorce. It was the home where Ava had taken her first steps. Paul purchased the house under a trust name. He had restored it with warmth, sunlight, colored curtains, fresh paint, and a nursery room quietly refurbished. He said nothing to Isla. That evening, as the documents were submitted and the court set a hearing date for reopening the custody case, Paul walked out to the guest house. He found Isla sitting under the stars and handed her a key. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "A place of your own," he said. Place to start again. Safe if things get difficult. A safe harbor. No one knows I bought it. Not even Howard. Isla stared at the key, silent. Paul's voice lowered. "Just a backup, just in case. You and Ava deserve a home that's yours." Her eyes filled with tears. She did not speak, but she stepped forward and hugged him tight, long and wordless. And in that moment, something between them shifted. Not just trust, not just gratitude, but the start of something deeper, something unspoken. The courtroom was colder than Isla remembered. Not because of the temperature, but because of the tension. This time, though, she was not alone. On her right sat Elise, calm and razor-sharp in her tailored navy suit. On her left, Paul Blake, his presence, a quiet signal of strength. The judge, an impartial replacement, brought in from another circuit due to the conflict of interest called the hearing to order. "We are here to re-examine the custody ruling in the case of Ela Montgomery versus Howard Kane. New evidence has been presented that may significantly alter the original decision." Howard's team came in with fire. Their lead barrister stood confidently, delivering a statement that painted Isla as unstable, erratic, and manipulative. "Miss Montgomery has a documented history of emotional volatility," the barrister began. "We submit that she is using these proceedings as a way to punish Mr. Kane, who has provided a stable, loving home for their daughter." Ila's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady. She had heard these accusations before. She had lived with them. What she had not expected was the slideshow they produced. Photos of Isla looking disheveled during her hospitalization. Medical notes doctored to suggest outbursts. They played recordings taken without her consent of her crying, alone in her old home, manipulated out of context. Paul clenched his jaw. It was time. He stood up as Elise called him to the stand. After being sworn in, he spoke calmly. "My name is Paul Blake. I'm a business owner and a single father of a 6-year-old boy I had no previous connection to either party until 3 months ago. That was when I witnessed Mr. Kane physically assault Miss Montgomery in a public park and forcibly take her child. There was a rustle in the room. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Paul continued. I intervened. I brought her to the hospital. I saw the bruises. I heard her story. And what shocked me wasn't just the violence. It was the look in her eyes, the helplessness of someone who had screamed for help and never been heard. He then described the following weeks, the quiet resilience Isla showed, her care for his son, Finn, her honesty. She is not unstable. She is a mother stripped of her rights. I've seen her sing Ava's lullaby while looking at her photo. I've seen her make breakfast while wiping tears from her eyes. She's not dangerous. She's broken, but she's healing. When he finished, the room was still. Ela sat motionless, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The judge turned to Elise. Miss Monroe, do you have additional requests? Yes, Your Honor. We respectfully request an immediate forensic audit of the medical records submitted in the original custody hearing and a review of any financial transactions between Dr. Greaves and Mr. Kane or his associates. Howard's team tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. Overruled, the judge leaned forward, her voice clear and deliberate. Until such investigations are complete, I am granting Miss Montgomery supervised visitation rights twice a week, effective immediately. Ela gasped. She clutched Elise's hand. Paul looked at her, smiling faintly. Howard stood frozen, his eyes locked on Ela, not with anger, but with the realization that his control was slipping. The judge concluded the session. The court takes the integrity of family law seriously. If there has been manipulation, it will be uncovered. This is not over, but justice begins now. As people filtered out, Paul remained seated beside Isla. She turned to him. You didn't have to speak like that, she whispered. He shrugged gently. Yes, I did. She looked at him, long and searching, before whispering, Thank you for seeing me. Paul didn't answer. He only nodded, because sometimes words were not enough. It was late afternoon when Paul asked Isla if she wanted to go for a drive. Where? She asked, wiping her hands on a tea towel, her eyes still a little puffy from the emotional court session. You'll see, he said with a quiet smile. They drove in comfortable silence, Finn asleep in the back seat, the late sunlight washing everything in soft gold. Ela looked out the window, unsure of where they were headed, until the streets started to look familiar. Her fingers tightened around the seat belt. Paul, she whispered. This neighborhood, he glanced at her, then pulled into the driveway of a modest but charming brick house with white shutters and newly painted steps. The lawn was trimmed. Flowers bloomed in the front beds. There was a new mailbox. It was her old house. Her breath caught. Why are we here? Paul parked, turned off the engine, and turned to face her. because I want to show you something." He got out and came around to open her door. She followed him, hesitant, her heart pounding as they stepped onto the porch. The last time she had stood here, her hands were shaking for different reasons. Trapped, silenced, watched. But now, the front door opened with ease. Inside, it was unrecognizable. The dark, suffocating walls were repainted in warm earth-toned colors. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by sheer curtains that let in soft light. The living room smelled like sandalwood and lemon. A small piano sat in the corner. Books lined the shelves, and a plush rug covered the once cold floor. Hila couldn't speak. "I bought it a few weeks ago," Paul said gently, standing a few feet behind her. "I didn't want to tell you until it was ready. I know this place has history for you, but I thought maybe we could give it a new one." She turned slowly, her eyes glistening. He motioned toward the hallway. "Come on, there's more." She followed him, her steps slow. He led her to the far bedroom once, the room Howard had locked her in during her worst nights. Now it was painted pale lavender. A small white bed sat against the wall, a stuffed rabbit propped up on the pillow. There were fairy lights strung along the headboard, a tiny bookshelf filled with picture books and colored pencils. Hila stared. "It's for Ava," Paul said softly, "for when she comes home." Isla turned to him, and something broke inside her, not in pain, but in release. She took a trembling step forward and wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest. "Paul," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you don't know what this means. This house, this place, it was a prison." She pulled back slightly to look up at him. "And now it's hope." Paul didn't speak. He only held her tighter. That evening they returned to Paul's home. Hila made dinner. Rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed carrots. Paul set the table, and Finn excitedly colored a picture of a superhero family, insisting that the mom had magic powers. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Hila read to Finn while Paul cleared up. Later, they all curled up to watch a film. Finn nestled between them. Hila found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. Later that night, when Finn had been tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Paul brought Isla a cup of chamomile tea. They sat on the porch wrapped in light sweaters, the stars blinking gently above. "I don't know how to thank you," Hila said, her voice hushed. "For everything." Paul looked at her, his eyes warm. "You don't have to." "I'm not doing it to be thanked." "Then why?" He hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Because I believe in you. And because no woman should have to rebuild her life alone." She stared at him, tears brimming again, but this time not from pain. They were from the beginnings of healing, from something that looked a lot like love. And from that night forward, Hila did not just exist beside Paul. She started to walk beside him, not as someone broken, but as someone choosing to rebuild one moment of kindness at a time. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Isla walked in beside her. Solicitor, her steps steady, but her heart pounding. Paul followed behind them, calm and focused, a quiet force of support. The seats were filled with journalists, court officials, and curious onlookers who had followed the case closely since news of Howard Kane's misconduct had begun to surface. Across the aisle, Howard sat with his legal team, his jaw clenched, his eyes avoiding Ila's. Gone was the confident posture, the smug demeanor. In its place was a man cornered, watching the empire he built start to crumble. The judge entered, and everyone stood. "Be seated," came the voice of authority that silenced the room. Ila's barrister stood first. "Your Honor, we are submitting final pieces of evidence, documents, recordings, and sworn statements that confirm Mr. Howard Kane manipulated the legal and medical systems to gain sole custody of his daughter under false pretenses." She handed the bailiff a USB drive. The judge nodded for it to be played. The courtroom went still as the tung speakers crackled. Then came a familiar voice. "Dr. Emerson Greaves, I was approached by Mr. Kane. He said it was urgent, that his wife was unwell. He offered a substantial donation to the hospital if I helped document certain symptoms she never showed during our sessions." Ila closed her eyes as the words spilled out. Her hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. The judge glanced down at the files in front of him. "You're saying this diagnosis was entirely fabricated?" Paul's solicitor called him to the stand. "I visited Dr. Greaves myself, Your Honor," Paul stated clearly. "I posed as a potential donor for the hospital. During our meeting, he admitted, without realizing he was being recorded, that he had never clinically diagnosed Ila. He confirmed what he wrote was at Howard Kane's request in exchange for financial favors." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Next, Elise introduced the sworn affidavit from the former housekeeper. "I saw Mr. Kane hit her. I heard her cry in that house more than I heard her speak. She wasn't unstable. She was trapped." The judge looked visibly disturbed. "Mr. Kane, do you have anything to say regarding these claims?" Howard's barrister began to object, but Howard stood abruptly. "It's a lie, all of it. She's manipulating the court now. Enough!" The judge's voice cut through the outburst like a whip. "You will have your turn, Mr. Kane." But Howard's composure had cracked. He kept muttering under his breath as his barrister tried to calm him. The mask was slipping. After a tense silence, the judge leaned forward. "Based on the sunsa, overwhelming evidence, and the credibility of the witnesses, the court finds that the previous custody ruling was made under fraudulent and unethical circumstances." Ila's breath caught in her throat. "Full and immediate custody of Ava Kane is to be placed with her mother, Ila Montgomery. Mr. Howard Kane is barred from contacting the child or the mother, directly or indirectly, until further review. A criminal investigation into the misuse of power, bribery, and falsification of documents will proceed immediately." The judge rapped her knuckles sharply on the bench. It was done. Ila stared at the bench in stunned silence. Then her hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her solicitor placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but it was Paul, who stepped closer, kneeling beside her chair. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "We did it. Outside the courthouse, a light drizzle began to fall. The sky was gray, but Isla didn't feel its weight. Not anymore. As they reached the steps, a soft voice called out, "Mummy!" Isla turned just as Ava sprinted through the rain, arms wide, her curls bouncing. Ila dropped her bag and fell to her knees, catching her daughter in a trembling embrace. "I missed you so much," Ava cried into her shoulder. "They said I couldn't see you. I'm here now, baby," Isla whispered into her hair. "And I'm not going anywhere." Behind them, Paul stood, with Finn, who smiled as he watched Ava cling to her mum. Paul's gaze met Isla's as she stood, her daughter in her arms. "I don't know how to thank you," Isla said, softly walking toward him. "No one ever stood up for me like you did." "You didn't need saving," Paul said, gently. "You just needed someone who saw you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Well, now I do. I see you, Paul." And under the quiet rain, with their children, safe and close, something new began. Not in a courtroom, not on paper, but in the warmth of two hearts, learning to trust again. 1 year had passed, and the world looked very different for all four of them. The house near the woods once, Paul's quiet retreat, had become a home in the truest sense. In the mornings, the sound of tiny feet echoed through the halls as Ava and Finn chased each other to the breakfast table. The air smelled of cinnamon toast and fresh coffee. There were finger paintings on the tuktukla, fridge, muddy shoes by the door, and soft lullabies hummed in the evenings as two children drifted to sleep under one roof. Paul and Isla had co-founded an organization called Mother's Voice. It was more than a charity. It was a movement. A space where women who had once been silenced found the courage to speak, to rebuild, to rise. Ila led with compassion, her own story empowering others. Paul used his resources and network to build shelters, fund legal teams, and lobby for real policy change. Their days were full, but never too full for each other. In stolen, quiet moments, they shared tea on the porch, whispered dreams beneath the stars, and laughed over spilled juice and bedtime negotiations. One afternoon, fell. Paul stood with Isla under the covered porch. The children were napping. The world was hushed. "I used to dread rainy days," Isla said, hugging her sweater close. "They reminded me of when everything felt so heavy." Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Then maybe it's time to rewrite what rainy days mean." Her breath caught. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring. No diamonds, no flash, just something warm and meaningful. "I don't want a perfect life," he said, his voice low and certain. "I want this life. With you, with our children, with the chaos and the calm. Will you marry me, Isla?" She didn't speak at first, just nodded, her eyes glistening with quiet joy. Then she whispered, "Yes." 1,000 times, yes, that evening, they told the children, over dinner. Finn gasped and clapped his hands. Ava smiled shyly and asked, "Does this mean we'll all have the same last name?" Paul chuckled. "Only if you want it, sweetheart." The house filled with laughter. Later that night, under the soft, yellow glow of the dining room lamp, the four of them sat around the table. The meal was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, peas, but it tasted like a celebration. On the wall behind them hung a framed photo taken just weeks earlier. It showed the four of them sitting on a picnic blanket, Finn's arm around Ava, both of them grinning. Hila was mid-laugh, her head tilted back. Paul had his arm around her, his eyes soft with a love that was plain for all to see. No shared blood, but everything else, hope, healing, choice, was theirs. Beneath the photo, on a small, delicate plaque, were the words, "We cannot change the past, but love and justice can rewrite the rest." And that was exactly what they had done. If this story stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you that love, justice, and quiet, courage, can rebuild what the world tries to break, then you are exactly where you belong. Here at Soul-Stirring Stories, we bring you tales that matter. Stories that lift the forgotten, speak for the voiceless, and remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is light, often found in the most unexpected places. If Isla and Paul's journey moved you, we invite you to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, inspire, and bring people together. Until next time, remember, even when the world says it's over, kindness can whisper, "It's just beginning."